I'm Rafael Gomez, host of Speaking Freely here on TLN, and now host of our mayoral candidates interview series, where we've interviewed the top candidates in the City of Toronto's election this spring. An election that's unlike any other. Over 48, maybe 50 candidates now have signed up for the candidature of the mayoral's race, and the top candidates have certainly emerged, and it's a very crowded field. But we're here to listen to what they have to say. So today we have Josh Matlow, longtime councillor for the City of Toronto, and with a connection to TLN. He's also the councillor in the ward where the Salsa in St. Clair, now Salsa in Toronto Festival occurs every year. So you're very familiar with TLN and the Salsa in St. Clair Festival, as you still call it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
we love the alliteration, but we also love the vibrancy and the fun that it brings to St. Clair every season.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll get started. We're going to talk. We've talked to each candidate. We're going to talk to you about why you've run. So maybe that's where we'll start. You're a longtime councillor, been very successful. It's a very crowded field, as you know. What makes your pitch distinct? Why are you running to be mayor of the entire city?
Well, first of all, I think it's great for our democracy that so many people are registering to run. We haven't had a very contested mayoral election, if we're to be honest, for several years. So I think it is important to have a contest of vision and ideas for our city, and I think it's just great for Torontonians. Now, I'm running because I believe that a better Toronto is possible, and I feel like our city has been in a malaise for many years. We have not been investing in services adequately, and in fact, many of them have been declining. So I want our city to be safer. I want it to be more affordable, and I want it to be more livable. I don't accept that a good way to run the TTC is to cut the services and make more delays, but then hike the fares. I don't accept that a Canadian city shouldn't be able to clear the snow sufficiently, never mind how incompetently it is these days. I don't believe that, as a parent, that we should go through almost like the Olympic Games to even get our kid into a rec program by clicking early in the morning, competing with everybody else. Right. So there's so much work that I want to do to make our city really more affordable, livable, and safer, because I am hearing from a lot of people that the city has changed over the years, but I don't believe that we've been addressing the root causes of the problems that we have today.
All right, so that's good. I mean, the themes are there, and actually, you can give yourself credit, or you can say this was a big political mistake. You came right off of the first week of your campaign. In fact, the very first promise you made was to actually raise taxes. Is this correct?
It is, and I know that's not conventional to launch a campaign promising that.
But so that feeds into what you're just saying. How is it that we have to have continuous tax increases, whereas some people on the other side have argued, before you do that, shouldn't you look at where expenditure happens? You just mentioned snow removal is a perennial misfire for many people. Yep. The way in which our services are structured, you mentioned the Olympic Games, some people call it the Hunger Games. Trying to get your child in a city-run program is very, very difficult and archaic. That's the current situation.
That's right.
Wouldn't it be prudent to maybe look at how things are run now and then decide whether you need to raise revenues or not?
Well, and that's the point. It's not a binary choice. The reality is, by looking at how things are being run now, we can see that we are starving a lot of these programs and services of the necessary resources to be successful. So, I've always led the charge at City Hall to, where we shouldn't be wasting money. I demand that we do better. So that has to continue happening. I don't believe, for example, that we should be the only city in the entire world that's investing, over $1 billion to rebuild a small section of an expressway that's crumbling down, when there are better alternatives that could save that money and then invest into priorities. Right. When Smart Track was announced, that wasn't ever real. Yet we ended up paying hundreds of millions of dollars for a provincial project that never even delivered the promised stations that the former mayor announced. So, yes, we need to find savings within what we have, but the reality is, I don't believe that anyone running to be your mayor, Torontonians' mayor, can earn people's trust by pretending that we can improve the services and get what we need without paying for it, because that's not living in the real world. So I'm convinced by what Torontonians tell me, that if they see a dedicated fund, the City Works Fund, that goes directly toward the very services that they rely on, but they know have been declining for many, many years. They're willing to make that investment because they rely on them, they care about them.
All right, so I guess I take you at your word. You've been in city politics for a long time, inside, so you kind of see, you probably see it better than others, what works, what doesn't, and you also see where there.
And I also live in the city and I experience it.
Fair enough, yeah. Let's talk about that, where you live. It's an asset, but I think in a city like Toronto, for those viewers who are outside of Toronto, this is a national broadcast station. We hit 5 million Canadians around the country. Toronto is actually an amalgam of 5 cities, and in the late 90s there was a amalgamation that occurred, and what we really had were 3 or 4 suburban communities, cities in themselves, that were merged with the old city of Toronto. We call that the mega city here in the city. I still don't think that we've really understood the impact that that's had on our civic politics, on the feeling that people sometimes feel alienated from City Hall. Just to put in perspective, if you're living in the northwest corner of the city hall is probably 20 kilometers from you, the current City Hall, whereas you used to have a City Hall that was close to you. To you, you're inner city, suburban, midtown, fair enough, but it's quite a different environment than the ones that people inhabit in the what we now call the inner suburbs. How do you speak to those voters? How do you speak to those challenges that people have on the periphery of the city who feel alienated from civic politics? And let me just be frank, some of the concerns, often on more the social, cultural side, that's the old city of Toronto, the downtown city of Toronto, seems to have this sort of concern with. How do you address that?
First of all, I think that's a really thoughtful question because because this happened, in the late 90s. We don't discuss it very often, but it's true. It's almost like a big family that was amalgamated, and we're all trying to get to know each other, and we come from different lived experiences and different, whether it be cultural, geographical backgrounds, and we're all trying to make this family work. So like a family, the reality is that there are differences, very unique differences that need to be validated, they need to be addressed, they need to be understood. And then, like all of us, there's commonalities that we can work on together to ensure that everyone has a great quality of life.
Well, the irony is Toronto had that model. We had metro governance in which policing services, the ambulance services were all supplied at this metro level. And then we had their local city councils or the city halls to address those local concerns. Is there any chance under a Matlow mayoral candidacy and eventual mayoral term that you would bring back power to these localities? In other words, decision making, deliberation, at a more local level, because I just see that as a major democratic deficit.
I mean, it's I think there's something comparable to how Mike Harris ignored the will of Torontonians back in the 90s. Like Doug Ford has been just unilaterally making announcements about cutting council in half, and the strong mayor powers that are inherently anti-democratic. Because
and just for our listeners, we used to have more councillors serving the city of Toronto just last year or 2 years ago.
So just to contextualize it for the national viewers, in 2018, Doug Ford, our premier, without consulting Torontonians or City Council, decided to cut not only the number of city councillors roughly in half, but also the wards. So in other words, they were combined, so one city councillor would represent almost double the population, which
on average is how many people?
Over 100,000. Right. And we have ridings and wards throughout our country where you have one member representing 25,000. So it really took away that kind of grassroots element to the local representation. And then more recently, Doug Ford announced the strong mayor powers that created Toronto. Ottawa has access to it. They chose wisely not to use it. But Toronto chose to accept a strong mayor power that allow us the mayor of Toronto, to move forward with an idea or resolution with minority support on council, which would turn Toronto, frankly, into the only democratically legislative body in the world that doesn't govern with a majority, which means we wouldn't be democratic, which is wrong, and that's why I would disavow that power and ask the premier or maybe the next premier to rescind it. But to your point, there are areas like of our city like Scarborough and Etobicoke. These are what Rafael described as the inner suburbs that have unique challenges. They do feel like they're left out of a lot of the decisions that are made out of City Hall, or they're ignored. I just met with the Somali community, who I've gotten to know over over many months, in fact, in north Etobicoke, who have asked for 40 years for a community center. 40 years for a community center. So they see all these things happen downtown, and they wonder, why hasn't that been realized? So the idea that I could be in a position to finally help them realize their dreams and have a cultural hub for the Somali community, a Muslim community that also is often impacted by Islamophobia, that doesn't have a place for seniors to congregate and escape isolation, but also there's gun violence that they want to address, and they want spaces for the youth to be safe. And I'll give you another example. The Premier just announced, with the support of another candidate, to move the Science Center.
I was going to bring that up, by the way.
Well, may I run with that?
Yeah, please, yeah.
So the Science Center, again, for your viewers nationally, is this cultural hub that we have in the northern part of our city, in the Thorncliffe Park, Flemington Park area. That
large number of immigrants, recent immigrants to Canada,
racialized
large families, young families there,
economically disadvantaged in many cases. So thousands of these kids have access in this area, in part of our inner suburban city, to free programming. A lot of people have access to jobs there. And it's a sense of pride too. I mean, every cultural hub shouldn't be downtown. We want them downtown, but not exclusively downtown. And the Premier, along with another candidate, unilaterally made announcements that they wanted to move the Science Centre down to the waterfront at Ontario Place. And what that did to that community was, once again, just tell them that they don't matter. Nobody asked them, and it didn't consider the context that I just described.
And talk about misinformation. They're now labeling it as a decaying and decrepit building. It's far from that. It's a beautifully built Moriyama architect, famous Canadian architect, Japanese origin. His family interred during World War II. You can say on and on. It's a cultural amenity that's you're not adding to, you're taking one away and putting it somewhere else.
And there were other two fallacies that they created as part of their narrative. One was that they were going to build housing there. There's already housing proposed on these oceans of parking lots, which that's reasonable. We need housing. We're in the midst of a housing crisis. But the building itself of the Science Center is on a floodplain built into a ravine. And that's not where it's going to happen. The other thing that they suggested, or one of the candidates suggested, is that somehow this would stop the giant spa that Doug Ford wants to be built at Ontario Place on our waterfront. The reality is, what Doug Ford's plan is to have a smaller Science Center next door to a giant spa, and we won't have the public park at the waterfront.
Right. So that's right. I mean, there's been some defense of this move because it preserves Ontario Place. It's not the right argument, and it's not true. Fair enough. So I want to bring you back to something you mentioned, order and disorder, and this perception that we've kind of created a less safe city post-pandemic. But that's kind of a misnomer too. Before the pandemic, we were seeing rising gun violence, gang violence among certain communities, and they were the most affected. In other words, your violence, your day-to-day violence is sometimes removed in the city of Toronto based on where you live. But if you live in certain communities, it's a daily occurrence of firing of a gun and violence of that nature. And we kind of turned a blind eye to it. Now in the post-pandemic world, as we re-entered the city, I think we were just caught off guard with some of the tendencies that were already brewing. I think the TTC is an issue, and you brought it up. It became kind of a way station for persons who were homeless. Not many people were using the TTC, so it obviously perhaps attracted more persons that lacked a home, had mental health issues. What do we do to repair the damage that some of the pandemic policies caused, in my opinion, and also not just create a safer city, but also the perception that we're actually doing something about it, that we're keeping people safe, but also helping those that do need help. The two have to go hand in hand. How do you address this?
Well, and I hope through my answer to contextualize some of the comments that you made as well, because it's my greatest frustration with how we often address these things is that there's an effort to make announcements that are very simple solutions to very complex problems. And it is complex. So the reality is that what we have been experiencing through and past the core of the pandemic didn't begin during the pandemic. I agree with you that it was exacerbated, and we see more of it, but much of what we're experiencing now are consequences of many years of neglect of really addressing in an honest and meaningful way, with the right investments, the root causes of the violence that we're experiencing. whether it be trauma, mental health, poverty, lack of access to housing, racism. And there were reports written years ago by, like, you may remember Alvin Curling and Roy McMurtry's Roots of Youth Violence report. So as city councillor, I brought forward initiatives like the youth equity strategy, and I've advocated for youth spaces in neighborhoods throughout the city because I do understand that the more real opportunities and interventions that we can provide in our communities, the safer our kids are, but also the rest of our society. So coming now to our current experience on the TTC, where people truly are feeling unsafe and even are choosing not to use the TTC because of that worry and that reality, that we need to, remind ourselves that the violence doesn't begin on the TTC. It may manifest there, but it's coming from our neighborhoods. So we need to address it where it's coming from. We need to make the investments into our neighborhoods, and that's why I announced substantive funding that I can source to ensure that we make meaningful investments that should have been done 10 or 20 years ago. What we also need to do in the TTC is, rather than make performative announcements like putting 80 police officers in random arbitrary places, which again looks like we're doing something, but we're not really doing something. I think we are better served to have mental health crisis response experts who have the knowledge and training to identify and de-escalate individuals who have the potential violence the time.
What about, to your point earlier, that it's not either or? The police presence does have an effect. So I deal with some work on sort of empirical applied analysis, right, of different phenomena. And I got into some of this issue around, does policing work? In a sense it does. You're right, it seems performative, but it does have a diminishing effect on criminality where the police are present. Your point is well taken, that if you put the police in the stations, crime will go somewhere else. True. That's where your second set of policies have to kick in, right? The underlying forces that create crime, perpetuate crime. I don't think you can do it either way. So you need the police, but you need these investments to thwart the development of criminality over generations and successive periods of time. How would you put
so I hear you, Rafael, and there are some who like try to make, again, this sort of these binary, sometimes even hyperbolic choices between, like, do you like the police, do you not, this kind of stuff, and it's a very American kind of.
Well, that was the problem. I think I'm glad we didn't go there as a society. The defund police argument, again, was a very simple binary choice. And it was not at all, I think, helpful to the debate or discussions we should have had. I don't think it came up here in the same way, but it was a tendency to think
the way that I see it and the way that I support it is that I do recognize that we can't continue to allow the $1.16 billion police budget to continue to balloon when we have such a we have an enormous shortfall in the 2023 budget at the City of Toronto, and we are facing a $46 billion budget pressure over the next 10 years. So it's just fiscally reckless to continue like an over $1 billion budget to increase and not invest adequately toward preventative measures that can prevent violence in the first place. So to your point about the police, we should support the police to do the good work that they do. What the rank and file officer tells me is that what they are not is they're not youth workers, they're not public health nurses. On the TTC, it's more effective to have people who look and act as people in authority to provide what you were alluding to, which is that sort of that, you're demonstrating to people that there is an authority there.
That's right. But it's not disorder, but order.
Exactly. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the police in this context, because you do want people who are better trained and knowledgeable to work with those who are in crisis. Because, I'm not a crisis expert, but intuitively, anyone who shoves a random person into the subway tracks is unwell. And you need somebody there who knows how to de-escalate that individual.
Well, on that note, I know it's a harbinger, I hope, of the in-depth discussions that occur on this campaign, where you get into some of these policies, not just at a surface level, but a more deep level. To your point around what constitutes a police officer or not, someone wearing a uniform that addresses that concern is, to my mind, the same idea.
We're on the same page.
But that has to be front and center. You need to be doing something to stem criminality now, and, of course, address the issues that perpetuate
May
crime in the
I,
future.
may I speak to another point that you raised?
One last point, sure.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm mindful of our time.
Yeah.
But you raised an important point about the homeless who have been seeking refuge in the TTC.
Yeah.
You know, the former mayor and some of the senior staff would say, well, let's just get people from the parks and on our streets into safe indoor spaces.
Yeah.
The problem was many of those individuals would keep saying, but we don't feel safe in those shelters. The shelters are unsafe. Our property, our bodies, we're not safe there. 3 a.m. bed checks, etc.
Yeah.
So we need to improve the shelter system along with having direct access to housing, which is the real way to solve homelessness, it's housing, so that they don't need to seek refuge on the TTC in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and that's a much better investment than the cell phone issues that have been coming up, is to make the subway safe with more cell phones.
Those are Band-Aids.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you, Josh, for joining
you.
us here, and I wish you good luck on the campaign.
I appreciate that.
Dealing with 48 other candidates.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that concludes our interview with Josh Matlow, running for mayor of the City of Toronto. Join us next time for our next mayoral candidate interview.